Hey everyone, ready to dive into a real head scratcher. Today it's consciousness, that feeling of being, experiencing the world.
And how. It's
Yeah.
everywhere, everyone's got it, but explaining it. We've
Yeah.
got dictionaries and encyclopedias trying to define it, and it's still a puzzle.
Right, like what is it really? Is it just knowing what's around us? Or does a plant turning to the sun count?
That's the thing. Is it more about self-awareness?
Yeah.
That, whoa, I'm thinking about thinking thing.
Exactly, it gets meta real fast. Which is why this deep dive is so cool. We've got Wikipedia, we've got Reddit, and they're talking about consciousness in other dimensions. Wild stuff.
Seriously, it's a topic that's been messing with philosophers and scientists forever. Even figuring out if someone like, say, Aristotle even had a concept of it is up for debate. Wikipedia mentions that.
It's funny, right? We all know what it feels like to be conscious, but the second you try explaining it,
Ugh. It's like trying to hold on to smoke.
it's true. And that's where some philosophers are like, hold up, does consciousness as a separate thing even exist?
Right. Maybe it's not an ingredient, but
Yeah.
just how our brains do their thing. Like, there was this philosopher, Gilbert Ryle. He thought consciousness was more like a bunch of our behaviors and habits all bundled up.
So not a mind separate from our bodies, but just our physical brains working.
Exactly. Which leads us to the big kahuna of philosophical questions, the mind-body problem.
Yeah.
How does something that seems so not physical come from something physical?
Right. It's like, how does music come out of a speaker? There's wires and stuff, but still.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And back in the day, you had Descartes, the I think, therefore I am guy. He was wrestling with this. Came up with dualism, this idea that the mind and body are made of totally different things.
Okay, so two totally different substances. Got it.
And he even thought the pineal gland, that tiny thing in the brain, was the connection point.
Wait, the pineal gland? Seriously, the thing that does melatonin, that seems way too small for something as big as consciousness.
You and most modern scientists, they're not on board with that theory. But Descartes was onto something with the question itself. If the mind and brain are different, how do they interact?
Right, because they clearly do something together.
And that's where you get a ton of different theories. Some folks are all about monism, the idea that there's just one kind of stuff in the universe.
Okay, time out. Monism. For those of us who aren't philosophy buffs, what's that in plain English?
Basically, it's like saying the universe is made of one fundamental ingredient. But even within monism, there are different flavors.
Flavors, okay, like ice cream.
Exactly. You've got your physicalism, which says everything's ultimately physical, your thoughts, your feelings, all of it. Then there's idealism, which flips the script and says everything is actually mental. Like, reality is all in our minds, man.
Whoa, so is the universe a giant brain, or are our brains just little universes?
You got it. And then, just to make it even more trippy, there are quantum mind theories. They suggest that consciousness might be linked to quantum mechanics, that weird stuff happening at the subatomic level.
Okay, we are definitely going down the rabbit hole with that one, but before we do, let's back up for a second. With all of these different theories, how do you even begin to study something as slippery as consciousness? You can't just be like, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how conscious are you feeling right now?
You're telling me. It's one of the biggest challenges in consciousness research. A lot of it relies on people describing their experiences, which, as you can imagine, isn't exactly the most precise method.
Right, it's like me trying to tell you what my dream was last night. Good luck with that.
Totally. But scientists have gotten creative. Ever heard of the mirror test?
I think so. It's about animals and self-awareness,
You
right?
got it. It's to see if an animal can recognize itself in a mirror,
Mm-hmm.
which could suggest some level of self-awareness.
So, like, they put a mark on the animal and see if it tries to touch it when it looks in the mirror.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And it's not just chimps. Dolphins, magpies, even some fish species have shown some signs of self-recognition.
Wait, fish? Like Nemo recognizing himself.
You'd be surprised. Though how a fish might experience self is probably very different from us.
Yeah,
But it makes you wonder, what's going on in those fishy brains?
totally. Okay, and speaking of things that make you wonder, this Reddit discussion we're about to get into is next level. They're proposing that consciousness is, wait for it, a dimension, like a literal dimension, just like the ones we experience in space and time. A dimension. Okay, you're gonna have to break this one down because that just melted my brain a little.
Right. It's a wild idea.
Yeah.
Not scientifically proven, of course, but this Reddit user, they used an analogy. Imagine a fish, right? Living in a flat, two-dimensional world.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Swimming around, but no up or down, just Flat.
Exactly. Now, we come along, us 3D beings, we can see the whole aquarium, we can reach in from above, which doesn't even exist to that fish.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. We're the fish stuck in our dimension, and there's this whole other consciousness dimension we're clueless about.
That's the theory.
Yeah.
Influencing us in ways we can't grasp, just like that fish wouldn't get why it suddenly got scooped up.
Whoa, okay, so if this consciousness dimension thing is even a little bit true, are we just stuck? Like, our minds have a limit we can't break.
$1 million question. And the Reddit user, they bring up this example from a fantasy series, the Stormlight Archive. There's a character, right? His intelligence changes drastically every day.
So, like, some days he's a genius, other days, not so much.
Way more extreme. Like some days he's figuring out the secrets of the universe. Next day, he can barely remember his own name. It's tragic because he knows it's temporary, so he tries to write down these incredible insights before they're gone. Inventing languages, scribbling formulas on anything he can find.
Oh, wow. That's heavy stuff. But it makes you think, what if we all have access to different levels of consciousness, but we're just locked out of most of it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to some actual scientific theories about how consciousness might work in the first place. Ever heard of the global workspace theory?
Vaguely. It rings a bell.
It uses the analogy of a theater stage.
Okay, so consciousness is
Yeah.
the stage or the play.
More like the spotlight. It shines on a specific set of thoughts, feelings. That's your conscious awareness right then, all the other stuff going on. That's your unconscious mind doing its thing behind the scenes.
So, like, our consciousness gets to choose what we focus on, what makes it to the spotlight. Makes sense. But our brains have all these different parts, right? How do they all work together?
Great point. This theory says that consciousness is the brain's way of taking all the information from those different areas, making it into one experience.
So instead of each part doing its own thing, consciousness is like a conductor, making sure it all works together.
Exactly. Then you've got integrated information theory. That one tries to actually measure consciousness by how well a system can connect information. More connections, more consciousness.
So like a human brain with its gazillion neurons would be more conscious than, say, a jellyfish.
You got it. Like the difference between a landline phone and the latest smartphone. Way more going on in that smartphone.
Yeah.
More connections, more possibilities.
Makes sense. Okay, but we can't forget about the quantum stuff. Remember those mind-blowing theories? What are they all about?
Ah, yes, the really out there stuff. Things like orchestrated objective reduction or ORCH-OR.
Or catchy.
It's the idea that consciousness is happening because of quantum stuff going on in these tiny parts of our brain cells called microtubules.
Okay, so our brains are basically quantum computers. I knew it. But seriously, isn't that a bit of a stretch?
It's definitely a fringe theory. A physicist named Roger Penrose and an anesthesiologist, Stuart Hameroff, came up with it. They basically said, regular physics can't explain how our minds work, so maybe it's quantum weirdness all the way down.
Like, our brains are tapping into a level of reality we don't even understand yet. That's both cool and terrifying. What do other scientists say about it, though?
It's pretty controversial, to say the least. Studying quantum stuff in the brain is crazy hard, so there's not a lot of evidence. But hey, you never know, right? Sometimes those wild ideas pan out.
True, true. So any other brain regions that have caught the eye of consciousness researchers?
There's one, a super interesting little area called the claustrum. Francis Crick, the DNA guy. He spent a big chunk of his career convinced that this was a key piece of the consciousness puzzle.
Wait, the Francis Crick? The one who helped discover DNA? That's a pretty big deal. What's so special about this claustrum thing?
It's this little sheet of neurons tucked deep inside the brain, and it's connected to everything, like a central hub. Crick thought it might be what brings all those different brain activities together into one conscious experience.
So kind of like Grand Central Station, but for your brain.
Perfect analogy. And get this, there was this case study a few years back. Doctors were studying a woman with epilepsy, and they stimulated her claustrum with electrodes.
Okay, so they're poking around her brain. What happened?
She lost consciousness completely,
Yeah.
not drowsy, completely out of it. And the moment they stopped the stimulation, she was right back, no memory of the gap.
Whoa, that sounds like pretty convincing evidence. So does that mean the claustrum is the on-off switch for consciousness? Case closed.
Not quite. It's just one case study, so it's tough to generalize. Might be other parts of the brain involved too. But it does suggest that the claustrum plays a pretty important role.
That's incredible. But if we're still figuring out human consciousness, what about animals? We can't exactly just ask a dog, so what's it like being you?
Yeah, it's not like they can tell us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But who hasn't looked at their dog and wondered what's going on in there?
Exactly. And that's a question that's been bugging people for ages. If an animal can't say, hey, I'm thinking, how do we even know if it's conscious?
Right. Like, it's totally possible, but how do you even study that?
Well, we can look at their behavior, see if they're doing things that suggest, complex thought, problem solving, maybe even emotions.
So, like, if they use tools
Hmm.
or show empathy, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And there's some fascinating stuff out there. Remember the mirror test. It's not just primates who pass. Dolphins, magpies, even some types of fish show signs of recognizing themselves.
Wait, fish? Like, they look in a mirror and are like, whoa, that's me. It's more complicated than that. And there's debate about it, but they show some signs. Now, what that self-awareness feels like to a fish? No clue. Totally different from us, probably. But still.
Mind-blowing. All these creatures experiencing the world makes you appreciate the diversity. But it also makes you think about our responsibilities, right? If we're not
Yeah.
the only ones feeling, experiencing.
Absolutely. Big ethical questions there. In fact, back in 2012, a group of neuroscientists got together and signed this thing called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. Basically, they're saying lots of animals, especially mammals and birds, have the brain stuff to make consciousness possible.
Wow. So the scientists are taking it seriously.
For sure. And not just consciousness, but sentience, too. Feeling emotions. That changes how we think about treating animals, ethically, legally. Huge implications.
Really makes that question of what is consciousness even bigger and who else has it.
And how did it even happen? Did it just poof appear with humans, or was it a slow evolution thing over millions of years?
Good point. Can't just appear out of nowhere, right?
Right? Evolutionary biologists are all over this. Some
Mm.
say, well, maybe consciousness helps us make sense of the world, put all our senses together. Others are like, maybe it's about planning for the future, staying safe, making smarter choices. And then there's the whole social angle. Maybe consciousness helps us understand other minds so we can cooperate, build societies.
So consciousness helped our ancestors survive, avoid danger, work together, pass on their genes.
And look at us now, still trying to figure out what it is.
Why?
But hey, we covered a lot today, right? From
Yeah.
philosophy to quantum physics and everything in between.
Right. And the main takeaway, we are just scratching the surface. There's so much more to discover about consciousness.
That's the best part, right? Always more to learn.
Yeah.
And listeners, here's something to think about. Remember that Reddit user, the dimension analogy? What if there are levels of awareness we can't even imagine? What if our reality is just a tiny part of something much bigger? Makes you think, doesn't it?